The silence of the archive was a living thing, a pressurized substance that filled the lungs and settled heavy in the bones. It smelled of processed air, the faint, sterile tang of ozone from the data purifiers, and the dry, whispering dust of centuries stored on crystalline wafers. Elian moved through this silence as if he were a part of it, a ghost in the machine of memory. His movements were precise, economical, honed by years of practice to produce no sound, no disruption. He was a creature of routine, of quiet order, and that order was his shield. Underneath the grey regulation tunic, a small auto-injector was sutured to the skin just above his hip, a constant, cool pressure against his flesh. It administered his life, a steady, metered dose of scent blockers and hormonal suppressants that kept the Omega in him caged, starved, and silent. He was designated Archivist 734, a functional beta in the eyes of the consortium. He was nobody. And nobody was safe. His fingers, long and pale, ghosted over a glowing console, the light reflecting in the flat, emotionless surface of his eyes. He was cataloguing pre-collapse literature, fragments of poetry that spoke of things his world had surgically removed. Unruly passion, chaotic love, the wild, unpredictable surge of biology. The words felt like a foreign language, describing a world of impossible color. My soul is a landscape of rain. One fragment read. Elian touched the glowing text, a flicker of something alien moving behind his ribs. Rain. He had only ever seen recycled, nutrient-rich water dispensed from ceiling-mounted sprinklers on a strict civic schedule. He could not imagine it falling wild and unbidden from the sky. The longing was a dull ache, a phantom limb he had learned to ignore. But some days, the phantom screamed. Today was one of those days. The injector site itched, a deep, persistent irritation that signaled the need for a cartridge replacement. His current prescription was running low, and the quarterly review required for renewal was still 2 weeks away. A cold dread, familiar and slick, coiled in his gut. The control he so carefully curated was fraying at the edges. The silence of the archive suddenly felt less like a comfort and more like a tomb. It was the sterile quiet of a specimen jar. That night, the ache was too loud to ignore. He stood before the polished chrome of his small sanitation unit, the reflection showing a man made of grayscale and shadows. The face looking back was a careful construct, hair trimmed to regulation length, jaw held in a tight line of neutrality, eyes deliberately empty. But beneath the surface, the wolf was pacing. The Omega, starved for a scent, for a touch, for a single moment of uncontrolled reality, was clawing at the bars of its chemical cage. He thought of the whispers he'd heard in the service tunnels, the illicit data cards passed between couriers. He thought of the Black Mask, an event held in the Undercity, in the abandoned geothermal vents where consortium surveillance was a flickering, unreliable thing. A place where designations were shared at the door like overcoats, where an alpha could be an alpha and an omega could be an omega for a few precious, anonymous hours. No names, no histories, no consequences. One night only. The thought was a spark in the dry tinder of his soul. It was madness. It was suicide. If he were caught, his carefully constructed life as a beta would be stripped away. He would be redesignated, collared, and assigned. A ward of the state, a broodmare, a thing. But the silence in his sterile apartment was screaming now, and the poetry was burning behind his eyes. A landscape of rain. He wanted to feel the storm, just once. He shut down the reflection with a wave of his hand. the chrome surface going dark. The decision was not made with logic. It was made with the desperate, primal instinct of a creature suffocating. He took a spare neutralizer patch, one meant for emergencies, and pressed it over the injector port. It would block the suppressants for 12 hours, a dangerous, reckless window. He didn't allow himself to think. He simply moved, pulling a dark, hooded cloak from the back of his closet, a relic from a theatrical archive he was supposed to have incinerated. He found a simple, featureless mask of polished black ceramic. He was not Archivist 734 tonight. He was not a beta. He was not even alien. He was a shadow slipping into the veins of the city, seeking a fire to cauterize the ache of a lifetime lived in monochrome. He was a ghost, finally choosing to haunt. The Undercity thrummed with a life the sterile upper levels had forgotten. It was a cacophony of steam hissing from rusted pipes, the low bass of unsanctioned music vibrating through the grimy floor plates, and the thick, layered scent of living bodies. Here the air was not processed. It was a rich, chaotic soup of sweat, spice, desperation, and defiance. For Wallian, whose senses had been chemically muted for over a decade, the onslaught was dizzying. The neutralizer patch was working. The edges of the world were sharpening, colors bleeding into his grayscale vision. Scents, thick and complex, were beginning to filter past his blockers. He could smell fried protein from a street vendor, the acrid tang of illicit synth ale, the damp mineral scent of the tunnel walls, and beneath it all, something else. Pheromones, alphas, betas, omegas, all mingling, their biological signatures painting the air. It was terrifying. It was intoxicating. He kept his hood low, the ceramic mask cool against his face, and followed the thrum of the music to a heavy steel door marked with a temporary, flickering, hollow sigil. A shattered mask. He showed the guard his entry chit, a sliver of untraceable currency, and the door hissed open. Inside, the world dissolved into heat and sound and shadow. The air was thick enough to taste, a heady cocktail of powerful, undiluted scents. Masked figures moved, through clouds of scented smoke, their bodies swaying to a primal, hypnotic beat. There were no uniforms here, no designations on display. There was only the raw, biological truth of predator and prey, of dominant and submissive, all engaged in a temporary, consensual dance of anonymity. Elian's instincts, so long dormant, awoke with a violent shudder. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the music. The Omega in him, starved and wild, was simultaneously terrified and ecstatic. He felt exposed, vulnerable, a lamb in a forest of wolves. But he also felt a thrilling, terrifying sense of rightness, of coming home to a body he had never been allowed to inhabit. He found a dark alcove, pressing himself into the shadows, trying to breathe, trying to recalibrate a sensory system that was rapidly coming online. He could smell them all. The earthy, stable scent of betas, the sharp, aggressive tang of alphas, scents like burnt sugar, like ozone, like spiced wood and musk, and to his shock, the softer, sweeter notes of other omegas, scents of milk and honey, of night-blooming flowers, of rain-soaked earth. He was not alone. The realization did little to soothe the panic. An alpha, broad-shouldered and wearing the mask of a snarling wolf, paused near his alcove, head tilting as he scented the air. His pheromones washed over Elian, aggressive and possessive, and a wave of pure, instinctual fear made Elian's knees weak. He shrank further into the shadows, pulling his cloak tighter, praying his own scent was still too muted to notice. The alpha huffed, disappointed, and moved on. Elian let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. This was a mistake. He should leave. He should run back to his sterile silence and beg his chemical cage to hold him fast. But then, a new scent cut through the chaotic miasma. It was not loud or aggressive. It was sharp, clean, and cold, like the air after a lightning strike, with an undercurrent of something metallic and unyielding, like forged steel. It was a scent of absolute control, of immense, disciplined power. It sliced through the club's humid chaos and went straight to the base of his spine. It was the most terrifying, most compelling thing he had ever smelled. He looked for the source, his eyes scanning the throng of masked bodies. And then he saw him. The alpha stood near the center of the room, yet seemed utterly separate from it. He was tall, dressed in a simple, perfectly tailored black tunic that spoke of wealth and status far more than the garish costumes around him. His mask was as simple and severe as his clothes, a smooth silver plate that covered the upper half of his face, leaving only a firm, unsmiling mouth and a strong jaw visible. He was not dancing. He was not socializing. He was simply observing, a pillar of stillness in the swirling chaos. And he was looking directly at Elian. Their eyes met across the room. Elian couldn't see the alpha's eyes behind the silver, their mask, but he felt the weight of his gaze, a physical pressure. The alpha's scent intensified, not in a display of aggression, but as a simple, undeniable statement of presence. I am here. I see you. Elian's breath hitched. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but something else was rising with it, a strange, magnetic pull. The alpha was the embodiment of everything he feared: power, control, the dominant force of nature he had spent his life trying to erase from himself. Yet the quiet intensity in his stance, the sheer, unshakable self-possession, called to the most broken, hidden parts of him. The alpha took a single, deliberate step toward him, then another. He moved with a liquid grace that was utterly at odds with the rigid control his scent projected. The crowd parted for him as if by instinct. Elian was frozen, pinned by that invisible gaze, by that clean, cold scent that was now beginning to feel less like a threat and more like an anchor in the overwhelming sensory storm. He should have run. The sane part of him, the part that was Archivist 734, screamed at him to flee. But the starved Omega, awakened and trembling, held him fast. The alpha stopped a few feet away. The air crackled between them. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The question was there in the air, in the subtle shift of his pheromones, a silent, formal inquiry. Elian's own scent, a thing he hadn't consciously produced in years, began to bloom in response. It was shy at first, the scent of rain on dry stone, of crushed green herbs after a long drought, a scent of deep, hidden life. He saw the alpha's jaw tighten slightly, the only sign that the scent had registered. The alpha extended a hand, palm up. It was a simple, elegant gesture, an invitation, an offer of safe harbor, or a trap. Elian's hand trembled as he lifted it. His fingers brushed against the alpha's. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up his arm. The alpha's fingers closed around his grip firm and cool. He did not pull Elian from the alcove. He simply stood there, holding his hand, letting him acclimate to the contact, to the proximity. In that moment, surrounded by the chaos of the mask, the world narrowed to the space between them. The noise faded. The other sense receded. There was only the hypnotic beat of the music and the clean, cold scent of lightning and steel, now mingled with the emerging fragrance of earth and rain. The Alpha leaned in, his voice a low, quiet rumble that vibrated through Elian's bones, barely audible over the music. One night, he said. It was not a question. It was a statement of terms, a promise, and a boundary. Elian's throat was dry. He could only nod. One night. That was all he had come for, a single night to feel real before returning to the silence. He let the Alpha lead him from the alcove, his hand a secure anchor in the overwhelming sea of sensation. He was being led into the storm, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the rain. The room the Alpha led him to was in a private wing of the club, insulated from the noise and chaos. It was as stark and minimalist as the Alpha himself. A low bed draped in dark grey linens, a single chair, a small table with 2 glasses and a bottle of clear liquid. The air was cool, filtered, but the Alpha's scent was the dominant landscape, a clean, sharp territory that Elian was now willingly entering. The Alpha released his hand and turned to face him, the silver mask still hiding his eyes. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. This was the precipice, the final moment to turn back. Elian's body was a war zone of instinct and conditioning. The conditioning screamed of danger, of consequences, of the brutal reality that awaited him if he went through with this. The Omega, however, was purring, a low thrum of anticipation deep in his chest. It was drawn to the Alpha's power, to the sheer, unshakable certainty he projected. It was a craving for an anchor, for a force strong enough to shatter the walls of his prison. "Your mask," the Alpha said, his voice as cool and smooth as polished stone. He gestured to Elian's face. It was a request, but it felt like a command. Elian's hands, clumsy with a tremor he couldn't control, rose to the black ceramic. He lifted it away. The air of the room, cool on his suddenly exposed skin, felt like a caress. He felt naked, stripped of his last layer of anonymity. He kept his eyes lowered, fixed on the dark grey of the Alpha's tunic. He heard a faint, sharp intake of breath. He dared to look up. The Alpha was still, his masked gaze fixed on Elian's face. Elian could not read his expression, could not guess his thoughts. Was he disappointed, intrigued, disgusted? The silence was a form of torture. Then the Alpha moved, his own hands rising to the silver plate. He unfastened it with a quiet click and lowered it. Elian's breath caught in his throat. The face he saw was not what he had expected. He had imagined someone harsh, perhaps cruel. But the man before him was beautiful in a severe, sculpted way. High cheekbones, a strong jawline shadowed with dark stubble, and a mouth that looked as if it had never learned to smile. But it was his eyes that held Elian captive. They were the color of a winter sky, a pale, piercing grey, and they were filled with a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a man carrying an impossible weight, a man as trapped in his own way as Elian was in his. In that moment of recognition, of seeing the cage behind the Alpha's eyes, Elian's fear finally dissolved, replaced by a wave of something far more dangerous. Empathy. The Alpha placed their masks together on the small table, side by side, the featureless black ceramic and the imperious silver plate, 2 discarded identities. "No names," the Alpha stated, his voice softer now, a low murmur. Elian nodded, unable to speak. His own scent was growing stronger, blooming in the cool air, a clear signal of invitation and surrender. It was the scent of a parched land, finally greeting the rain. The Alpha's eyes darkened, the pupils dilating. His own scent thickened, the clean ozone note deepening, becoming charged, electric. He didn't move, didn't rush. He held Elian's gaze, allowing the pheromones to speak for them, to bridge the final distance. It was a slow, deliberate seduction, a negotiation conducted on a purely chemical level. The omega in Elian arched toward that scent, that power, that control. It recognized a dominant force that could provide the one thing it craved above all else: release, a complete and total surrender of the crushing burden of self-awareness. He took a hesitant step forward. The alpha remained still, a statue of discipline, making Elian close the distance himself. It was a test, a demand for consent. Elian stopped just before him, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. He lifted a trembling hand and placed it on the alpha's chest, over his heart. He could feel the steady, powerful beat beneath his palm. Thump, thump, thump. A rhythm as calm and relentless as the man himself. The alpha's hand came up to cover his long, cool fingers engulfing Elian's. His thumb stroked the back of Elian's hand, a small, shocking gesture of tenderness. The contact sent a shiver through Elian's entire body. Then finally, the alpha moved. He lowered his head, his gaze never leaving Elian's, and his mouth claimed Elian's in a kiss that was not gentle, not tentative, but was not brutal either. It was a kiss of absolute possession. It tasted of control and loneliness and a deep, unspoken hunger. It was the taste of the storm breaking. Elian's mind went blissfully, terrifyingly blank. The archivist, the beta, the years of suppression, all of it burned away in the searing heat of that first contact. There was only the alpha's scent filling his lungs, his arms a steel cage of safety around him, his mouth branding him. He was falling, and for the first time, he didn't care if he ever hit the ground. He was lost in the rain, and he was drowning. It was a beautiful, terrible, glorious death. The night was a fever dream, a maelstrom of sensation that obliterated a lifetime of sensory deprivation. Elian had existed in a world of muted greys, and this was a universe of violent, searing color. Every touch was electric, every scent was a story, every sound was a symphony. The alpha was a force of nature, a controlled storm. His movements were precise, powerful, yet there was a current of desperation beneath his disciplined exterior. He was not just taking, he was seeking a something, a refuge, a moment of oblivion. Elian understood that hunger. He met it with his own. He was a creature starved, and he feasted on the reality of the alpha's body, the rough texture of his jaw against his cheek, the solid weight of him, the clean, sharp scent that had become his entire world. Time lost all meaning. There was no past, no future, only the tangled limbs, the slick skin, the ragged breaths in the cool, dark room. The omega in him was unbound, a wild, joyous thing that had never been allowed to live. It reveled in the submission, in the feeling of being so thoroughly claimed, so completely overwhelmed. It was not a violation, it was a homecoming. At the peak, as his body convulsed and his vision shattered into points of light, a primal, instinctual cry was torn from his throat. In that same moment, he felt the alpha's body go rigid against him, a low growl rumbling in his chest. And then, a sharp, searing pain exploded at the side of his neck, a fire that spread through his veins, a brand of lightning and steel. His mind screamed, a bite, a claiming, not just a night, a lifetime. The shock of it was a bucket of ice water, snapping him back into a horrifying clarity. Through the haze of pleasure and pain, he saw the alpha's eyes, wide with a mirrored shock. The pale grey irises were blown wide, the pupils black holes of disbelief. The disciplined control in his face had shattered, replaced by a raw, animalistic instinct that he was clearly fighting to contain. He pulled back, his mouth slick with Elian's blood, a guttural sound of denial caught in his throat. The bond, hot and electric, was already snapping into place between them, a psychic tether woven from instinct and pheromones and a terrible, irrevocable mistake. Elian felt it, a jolt of the alpha's panic, his fury at his own loss of control, a cold, sharp wave of regret. It crashed against the shores of his own mind, an invasion of terrifying intimacy. He scrambled back on the bed, pulling the linens around himself, his hand flying to his neck. The skin was broken, bleeding, the teeth marks a brutal flower blooming on his flesh. The mark, the ultimate cage. He had traded one prison for another, infinitely smaller, infinitely more permanent. The alpha stood by the bed, his chest heaving, his face a mask of stone once more, but his eyes were wild with a conflict that terrified Elian. He looked at the mark on Elian's neck, then at Elian's face, and the weariness Elian had seen in him earlier returned, magnified 1,000 times. It was the look of a man watching his own carefully constructed world burn to the ground. This was not, he started, his voice a raw rasp. He couldn't finish. He didn't need to. This was not supposed to happen. One night only. The words echoed in the ruins of the room, a bitter, mocking epitaph for their stolen moment of freedom. He turned away, grabbing his tunic, his movements stiff, mechanical. He was rebuilding his walls, brick by painful brick. Elian could feel it through the bond, the shutting down, the compartmentalizing, the cold, ruthless reassertion of control. No, Elian whispered, the word a tiny, broken thing. He wasn't sure what he was denying. The bite, the bond, the dawning horror that his life, the one he knew, was over. The alpha dressed without looking at him again. He picked up his silver mask from the table and stood there for a long moment, his back to the bed. Elian could feel the storm of his thoughts, the cold, calculating logic battling with the raw, primal instinct. He was assessing the situation, analyzing the damage. He was not a lover. He was not a partner. He was a strategist confronting a catastrophic failure. "Stay here," the alpha commanded, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. "Do not leave this room. Someone will come for you." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. The alpha in him, now bound to Elian, was asserting its dominance, its right to control. Elian flinched, as if struck. The Omega in him, betrayed and terrified, wanted to obey, to curl up and wait for the master who had branded it. But the man, the archivist who had spent his life fighting for a sliver of autonomy, rebelled. He said nothing. He just watched, his heart a frozen lump of ice in his chest, as the alpha placed the silver mask over his face, erasing the man and becoming an icon of power once more. The alpha walked to the door, paused with his hand on the handle, but did not turn around. "I will handle this," he said, and the words were a chilling promise of control, not comfort. Then he was gone, the door hissing shut behind him, leaving Elian alone in the cool, silent room that now felt like a gilded cage. He was alone with the searing pain in his neck, the terrifying alien presence of the alpha's emotions in his head, and the ghost of a scent that now smelled not of liberation, but of chains. The morning light that filtered through the room's single high window was the color of ash. Elian had not slept. He had remained huddled on the bed, the linens a tangled shroud around his shivering body, his hand pressed against the throbbing, crusted wound on his neck. The bond was a living thing inside him, a parasitic vine coiling around his soul. It pulsed with a steady, rhythmic drip of the alpha's consciousness. It was a cold, disciplined hum, like a powerful engine idling. There was no heat, no passion, only an immense, tightly leashed control and a deep, resonant frequency of duty. It was a chillingly sterile emotion to feel emanating from the man who had torn his world apart. The Omega in him was in agony. It had been awakened, claimed, and then abandoned. It craved the Alpha's presence, his scent, his touch, with a desperation that was clawing him apart from the inside. It whined and paced in the back of his mind, a frantic, miserable creature. But Elian, the man, fought it. He focused on the cold dread, on the stark reality of his situation. He was a marked Omega, unregistered, unbonded in the eyes of the consortium. The Alpha was a stranger, a powerful masked figure who had promised to handle him. The word echoed with sinister possibilities: reconditioning, termination, a quiet disappearance into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of the US consortium's correctional facilities. He had to get out. The Alpha's command to stay was a physical weight on his instincts, but his will to survive was stronger. He slid off the bed, his legs unsteady. His own clothes were folded neatly on the chair where he'd left them. He dressed with trembling fingers, the familiar grey of the regulation fabric, a mocking reminder of the life he could never return to. His cloak and mask were gone, taken by the Alpha, or cleared away by the club's discreet staff. It didn't matter. He couldn't hide now. The mark on his neck was a beacon. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair and took a deep breath, trying to center himself. He was Archivist 734. He was resourceful. He knew the city's systems, its hidden pathways. He had to get back to his apartment, retrieve his emergency credit chits, and disappear into the Undercity's sprawling anonymity. He could buy passage on a freight hauler to the outer sectors, maybe even off-world. It was a slim chance, but it was better than waiting like a lamb for the slaughter. He approached the door. It was unlocked. A small mercy, or an oversight. He didn't question it. He slipped out into the empty, silent corridor. The club was deserted, scrubbed clean of the previous night's chaotic energy. The air smelled of disinfectant, a chemical sterility that was a pale imitation of the Alpha's own scent. He made his way through the maze of hallways, following the emergency exit sigils, his every nerve ending screaming. The bond was a constant hum in his mind, but now he felt a subtle shift in the Alpha's emotions. The calm, idling control was being overlaid with a sharp, focused intensity. The Alpha was working. He was moving, commanding, directing. The feeling of power rolling off him in waves, even at a distance, made Elian's stomach clench. He pushed open a final door and found himself in a grimy service alley. The air, thick with refuse and damp, was a welcome shock after the filtered atmosphere of the club and the Alpha's room. He pulled up the collar of his tunic, trying to hide the mark, and merged into the sparse morning traffic of the Undercity. He moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, his archivist's knowledge of the city's layout guiding him through forgotten tunnels and maintenance corridors. He avoided the main transit hubs, knowing they would be monitored. Every uniformed enforcer he saw sent a jolt of pure terror through him. Were they looking for him? Did the Alpha already have his description, his designation, circulating through the system. The bond flared. A sharp spike of irritation from the alpha, distant but clear. Annoyance, frustration, and it was directed outward. No, inward. It was directed at him. The alpha knew he was gone. The realization sent a fresh wave of panic through Elian. He had disobeyed. He had defied the alpha who had marked him. The omega in him whimpered in distress, a primal fear of displeasing the dominant who had, or claimed it. Elian gritted his teeth, pushing the feeling down. He was not a pet. He would not be controlled. He finally reached his residential block, a towering spire of sterile, identical apartments. The lobby was empty, the auto servitor humming quietly in its alcove. He bypassed the main lift, taking the emergency stairwell, his footsteps echoing in the cold, concrete shaft. He climbed the 30 flights to his floor, his lungs burning, his body screaming in protest. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the psychic turmoil. He reached his apartment door, his hands shaking as he keyed in his entry code. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the familiar, silent grayness of his home. He stumbled inside, leaning against the closed door, his heart hammering. He was safe. For a moment, he had a plan. Get the chits, his emergency pack, and leave. Never look back. He crossed the small room to the false panel behind his nutrient dispenser. But as his fingers brushed against the cool metal, a scent stopped him cold. It was faint, almost undetectable, but it was unmistakably there. Lightning and steel. Clean, cold, and utterly dominant. Here, in his sanctuary, in his home. His blood ran cold. He scanned the room, his eyes wide with terror. Everything was in its place. Nothing was disturbed, but the scent was proof. He had been here. He knew who Elian was. He knew where he lived. The bond pulsed again, and this time it was not distant. It was close. So close. A feeling of calm, implacable certainty washed over him, an emotion that was not his own. It was the alpha, and he was waiting. Slowly, Elian turned. Seated in the single, uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room, a figure emerged from the shadows. He was dressed not in the black of the night before, but in the severe, high-collared white uniform of a consortium director. On his chest, gleaming under the apartment's cold light, was the silver sigil of the Department of Domestic Security, the highest, most feared branch of the enforcers. The silver mask was gone, but the face was the same. The sculpted cheekbones, the firm mouth, the soul-crushing weariness in the pale winter sky eyes. It was him, Kyle, Director Kyle Valerius, the architect of the very system of Omega registration and control that Elian had spent his entire life fleeing. The alpha who had marked him, who had bound him, was the monster from his worst nightmares. He was the cage. Kyle did not smile. He simply watched Elian, his expression unreadable, his powerful scent a suffocating blanket in the small room. "You were told to wait," he said, his voice a low, chillingly calm statement of fact. The bottom fell out of Elian's world. He had not run into a wolf's den. He had been born in it and had just discovered the identity of the keeper. The silence that followed Kale's statement was heavier than the pressurized quiet of the archive. It was the silence of a trap sprung, the profound stillness that comes after the last door has been locked. Elian stared at the man in the chair, the man who wore the face of his one-night liberator and his lifelong oppressor. Director Kyle Valerius. The name was a death knell. Elian had studied his directives, his cold, logical treatises on the necessity of biological regulation for societal stability. He was the ghost in the machine, the invisible hand that guided the policies that had suffocated Elian since birth. To find him here, in his home, wearing that uniform, was a disorienting, soul-shattering horror. The bond between them was no longer just a terrifying psychic link. It was a chain, tethering him directly to the heart of the system he despised. "How?" Elian whispered, the word barely a breath. Kyle's expression did not change. The weariness in his eyes seemed to deepen, etched there by 1,000 impossible decisions. "Your scent," he said, his voice flat, clinical. "Once I had it. Finding your biosignature in the civic registry was a simple matter. Your suppressants have made it faint, but the underlying markers are unique, unmistakable. Of course, it was that simple." In his desperate bid for one night of freedom, he had given his jailer the key to his cell. Elian felt a bitter, hysterical laugh bubble in his throat, but he choked it down. He could feel Kyle's emotions through the bond, a tightly controlled river of what? Not triumph, not anger. It was a cold, frustrating knot of complication. Elian was a problem to be solved, a variable that had been introduced into a flawless equation, threatening to bring the whole structure down. He was not a person to Kale. He was a crisis. "What do you want?" Elian asked, his voice gaining a thin, brittle edge of defiance. Kale's gaze dropped to the frantic pulse beating in Elian's throat, then to the crude, dark mark that sullied the pale skin just below. His mouth tightened into a thin line. "What I want is irrelevant," he said, the words precise and cold. "The situation is this. You are an unregistered Omega, illegally masking your designation. You are now carrying an unsanctioned, unrecorded alpha mark. My mark." He said the last two words with a quiet, profound self-loathing that sent a flicker of shock through Elian. "If you are discovered," Kyle continued, his voice dropping even lower, "you will be taken into custody by my department. You will be processed, studied, and reconditioned. Your life, as you know it, will be forfeit. And I," he paused, the winter in his eyes turning to ice, "will be scrutinized. My judgment, my control, my fitness to hold my position will be called into question. A director cannot afford such a catastrophic lapse in discipline." It was all there, the cold, brutal calculus of their situation. Elian's life was a liability. Kyle's career was at stake. There was no room for emotion, for the memory of the fevered, desperate connection they had shared. That had been an illusion. This was reality. "So, you've come to clean up your mess," Elian said, the words tasting like ash. "Are you going to have me terminated, erased from the registry? It would be the neatest solution." A flicker of something, pain, anger, he couldn't be sure, flashed across Kyle's face, so quick Elian almost missed it. He felt it through the bond, a sharp, hot spike that was instantly suppressed, smothered under layers of cold control. "Termination is an inefficient solution," Kale said, his voice clipped. "And it would not sever the bond. I would still feel—" He cut himself off, but Elian knew. He would still feel Elian's death, the final, agonizing snap of their connection. Kale stood up, his height and the severe lines of his uniform dominating the small room. He moved with the same contained grace as the night before, a predator in a cage of his own making. He stopped a few feet from Elian, close enough that Elian could feel the cool air displaced by his movement. "There is another option," he said. "A way to contain this. I can create a new identity for you, a protected status. You will be assigned to my personal domestic staff. You will live in my residence. You will be provided for, kept safe. The mark will be explained as part of a sanctioned, private contract. No one will question it. A gilded cage. The words screamed in Elian's mind. He would be Kyle's ward, his secret, his prisoner, hidden away in the heart of the consortium, under the watchful eye of the man who embodied everything he had ever fought against. It was a life sentence. No, Elian said, the word coming out stronger than he expected. I won't. Kyle's eyes narrowed. You misunderstand, he said, and there was a dangerous edge to his calm now. This is not a negotiation. It is the only way for both of us to survive this. Your defiance is a luxury neither of us can afford. He took another step, closing the space between them. His scent, clean and sharp, filled Elian's lungs, and the Omega in him instinctively, humiliatingly, wanted to submit, to lean into that strength, to let him handle it, to be safe. But the man, the archivist, the rebel, held firm. I would rather be processed than be your pet, Elian snarled, his own scent flaring with fear and defiance, the smell of rain turning sharp and acidic like a coming storm. A muscle feathered in Kale's jaw. The control was slipping. Elian could feel the Alpha's frustration rising, a hot, dangerous tide. It wasn't the anger of a tyrant being disobeyed. It was the deep, maddening frustration of a logician whose flawless proof was being rejected. You think this is about power? Kale's voice was a low, intense growl. You think I want this? To have my control fractured, my life tethered to a reckless, sentimental variable I can't account for? He reached out, his hand hovering in the air, just inches from Elian's face. I have spent my entire life eliminating variables. I am the system that protects this city from the chaos of emotion, from the weakness of biology. And you, in one night, you have become the embodiment of everything I have sworn to control. His fingers brushed Elian's cheek, a touch as cold as steel. Elian flinched, but didn't pull away. Through the bond, he was suddenly drowning in Kale's reality, an overwhelming, suffocating sense of duty, a profound, crushing loneliness, the constant, relentless pressure of upholding a perfect, sterile order. He saw the world through Kale's eyes, a chaotic, dangerous place that needed to be managed, contained, and protected from itself. And he, Elian, was the ultimate chaos, the ultimate threat. The revelation was dizzying. Kale wasn't his jailer because he was cruel. He was his jailer because he was terrified of the alternative. My protection is the only choice you have, Kale said, his thumb stroking Elian's jaw, the gesture a chilling echo of the tenderness from the night before. Accept it, or we will both be destroyed by the system I have built. The choice was no choice at all. Annihilation, or a life in a beautiful, bespoke prison. Elian looked into the winter of Kale's eyes and saw his own reflection, a small, trapped thing. And for the first time, he realized they were both prisoners, bound together by the same invisible chains. The transition was swift and seamless. One day, Archivist 734 was recorded as having taken an indefinite leave for medical reasons, his civic data sealed under a high-level security protocol. The next, Elian was a ghost, spirited away in a black, unmarked transport to the director's spire, the administrative and residential heart of the consortium. The spire was a monument to sterile power, a needle of polished chrome and reinforced glass that pierced the perpetually overcast sky. Kyle's residence occupied the top 3 floors, a space of breathtaking minimalism and cold, empty luxury. The walls were white, the furniture was black, and the vast floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city he controlled, a sprawling, glittering circuit board laid out below. It was beautiful, and it was the most desolate place Elian had ever seen. He was given a suite of rooms, larger than his entire former apartment block floor. The fabrics were soft, the lighting was programmed to mimic a natural diurnal cycle, and the nutrient dispenser produced gourmet-quality meals. He had access to a data terminal with a curated library far exceeding the public archives. It was a cage made of silk and comfort, and every moment in it was a new kind of suffocation. Kyle was a constant, distant presence. He was there in the faint, lingering scent of ozone and steel in the corridors, in the silent, efficient movements of the domestic servitors programmed to his exact specifications, and most of all, in the unceasing hum of the bond in Elian's mind. He could feel Kale working in his office floors below, a relentless torrent of cold logic, strategic planning, and unwavering control. He felt Kale's fatigue late at night, a bone-deep weariness that seeped into Elian's own limbs. He felt his frustration with inefficient subordinates, his satisfaction at a complex problem solved. He was privy to the inner workings of his captor's mind, yet they barely spoke. Their interactions were brief, formal, and excruciatingly tense. Kale would find him in the residence's sterile arboretum, where Elian spent hours staring at the genetically perfected, scentless flowers. "Is your accommodation satisfactory?" Kale would ask, his voice clipped and formal, his eyes never quite meeting Elian's. "Yes, Director," Elian would reply, his own voice a monotone. He refused to call him Kale. He refused to grant him that intimacy. The mark on his neck had healed into a pale, silvery scar, a permanent brand of their catastrophic mistake. He kept it covered with the high-collared tunics provided for him, but he could always feel it, a phantom itch, a reminder of his chain. The Omega in him was a tormented thing, surrounded by the constant, pervasive scent of its bonded alpha. It was in a state of perpetual, unfulfilled arousal. It craved Kale's touch, his presence, his approval, with a desperate biological need that warred constantly with Elian's conscious hatred and fear. Some nights, the craving was so intense he would curl up in his bed, shaking, his body aching with a phantom heat. He could feel Kale, floors away, feeling the echoes of his distress through the bond, and he could feel the alpha's own iron-willed suppression of the instinct to respond. They were two magnets, held poles apart by an invisible, unyielding force. Elian's rebellion took the form of quiet, passive resistance. He read the most subversive pre-collapse texts he could find on the data terminal. Poetry about wild, untamed nature, philosophical tracts on individual liberty, banned histories of Omega-led uprisings. He filled his silent rooms with the ghosts of a world Kyle had tried to erase. One evening, Kyle found him reading a particularly vivid poem about the ocean, a body of water so vast and chaotic it had been deemed an uncontrollable biohazard and vaporized centuries ago. "Sentimental fiction," Kale observed, his voice cold, standing in the doorway of Elian's sitting room. "It serves no practical purpose." Elian didn't look up from the glowing text. "It serves to remind me that a world outside of your control once existed," he said, the words quiet but sharp. He felt a flash of irritation from Kale through the bond, the familiar sting of his logic being challenged. The world before the collapse was inefficient, dangerous, and emotionally unstable, Kale stated, as if reciting from one of his own directives. "We created order. We created peace. You created a cage and called it peace, Elian shot back, finally looking up, his eyes flashing. You traded freedom for sterility. Kyle's jaw tightened. He walked into the room, his presence shrinking the already vast space. He stopped in front of Elian's chair, looking down at him. The freedom you speak of is the freedom to starve, to fight, to be ruled by base instinct. It is the freedom of the beast in the wilderness. We are not beasts, Elian. It was the first time he had used his name since that night. The sound of it from his lips was a shock, a branding iron on Elian's soul. It was too intimate, too real. Aren't we? Elian whispered, his hand subconsciously going to the scar on his neck. What was that night, Director? Was it logic? Was it order? Or was it two beasts finally letting themselves out of their cages? The blow landed. Elian felt Kale's composure crack, a hairline fracture in the glacial ice. He saw a flicker of the man from the club, the one with the profound weariness in his eyes, the one who had made a desperate human mistake. Kyle's scent sharpened, a flare of ozone that spoke of agitation. He took a half step back, as if physically recoiling from the memory. It was a lapse, he said, his voice a low, harsh rasp. A biological anomaly that has been contained. Contained. Elian stood up, his fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. Is that what I am to you? An anomaly? A pet to be locked away in your sterile tower until you decide what to do with me? I am not a problem to be solved, Director. I am a person whose life you have stolen. The bond between them became a raging torrent. Elian's fury, his despair, his suffocating claustrophobia poured into Kyle, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, he wasn't just receiving Kale's emotions. He was actively, violently projecting his own. Kale staggered back, a hand rising to his temple, as if struck by a physical blow. His face went pale. He was feeling it, all of it. The years of suppression, the terror of the mark, the hopeless desolation of this beautiful prison. The cold, analytical mind was being flooded with the very chaotic emotion he had dedicated his life to eradicating. Enough, Kyle gritted out, his control fraying visibly. But Elian couldn't stop. It was a dam breaking, a decade of silent screams finally finding a voice. You feel that? He hissed, advancing on Kyle, forcing the director of domestic security to retreat. That is what you have done. You can't file it away. You can't write a directive to contain it. It's inside your head now. You are bound to the chaos you so despise. They stood face to face in the center of the room, panting, the air thick with their conflicting sense and the turbulent psychic energy of the bond. Kyle stared at him, his winter sky eyes wide with something Elian had never seen in them before. Not weariness, not frustration. It was fear. He was afraid of Elian. He was afraid of the feelings Elian forced him to experience. He was afraid of the bond that had irrevocably contaminated his sterile soul. In that moment, seeing the fear in his captor's eyes, Elian felt a sliver of power. It was a dangerous, intoxicating feeling. He was not just a prisoner. He was a poison in the heart of the system. He was the variable that could bring it all down. The confrontation left a permanent shift in their dynamic. The polite, cold distance was shattered, replaced by a raw, volatile tension that hummed in the air between them whenever they were in the same room. Kyle began to avoid the residence, immersing himself in his work with a frantic, obsessive energy that Elian could feel through the bond. He was running, trying to drown out the constant, low-level broadcast of Elian's misery, with the familiar hum of data and logic. But there was no escape. Elian's presence was a permanent fixture in his mind, a ghost haunting his every waking moment. Elian, for his part, leaned into his newfound power. He continued to immerse himself in the forbidden literature, and he began to project the emotions those texts stirred in him through the bond. He sent Kale the soaring joy of a poem about flight, the defiant rage of a revolutionary's manifesto, the heartbreaking sorrow of a love sonnet. He was force-feeding the soulless director a diet of pure, chaotic humanity, using their bond as a weapon of psychological warfare. One afternoon, as Elian was reading a pre-collapse text on empathic theory, the very foundation of omega-alpha bonding that the consortium had dismissed as biological mysticism, a wave of intense physical pain, sharp and blinding, slammed into him through the bond. It was not his own. It was Kale's. He gasped, dropping the data slate, his hands flying to his head as the agony crested. It was a sharp, stabbing sensation behind Kale's right eye, accompanied by a wave of dizziness and nausea, a migraine, brutal and incapacitating. Without thinking, driven by an instinct he couldn't name, Elian focused his mind not on projecting, but on receiving. He opened himself to the pain, drawing it into himself, trying to lessen Kale's burden. It was a foolish, masochistic impulse, but the omega in him, the part that was hardwired to soothe its alpha, took over. The pain in his own head intensified, but he felt a corresponding lessening of the agony coming from Kale. He felt Kale's surprise, a flicker of confusion through the haze of suffering. "What are you doing?" The thought wasn't words, but a pure, conceptual query that shot across the bond. Elian didn't answer. He just held on, breathing through the waves of shared pain, anchoring Kale's consciousness to his own. He pictured a cool, quiet space, the silent stacks of the archive, the scent of old paper and dust, and pushed that sense of calm and order toward Kale. Slowly, agonizingly, the brutal edge of the migraine began to soften. The stabbing sensation receded to a dull, throbbing ache. He felt Kale's ragged breathing begin to even out. The entire episode lasted less than 10 minutes, but it left Elian drenched in sweat and trembling, utterly exhausted. The door to his suite hissed open. Kale stood there, leaning against the frame, his face pale and drawn. His pristine white uniform was rumpled, the high collar unfastened. He looked undone, vulnerable. He stared at Elian, his expression a mixture of disbelief, suspicion, and a fragile, terrifying hint of gratitude. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice rough. "I don't know," Elian answered honestly, his own voice shaky. "The bond. He couldn't explain it. It was instinct. It was biology. It was the mysticism he had just been reading about." Kale pushed himself off the doorframe and walked slowly into the room. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Elian. He raised a hand, not to strike, not to caress, but simply held it in the air between them, as if testing the reality of the space. "The pain," he said, his voice a low whisper of awe and horror. "It lessened. When you focused. You were loud," Elian said, searching for the words. "I couldn't ignore it." For the first time, Kale truly looked at him, not as a problem, not as a variable, not as a prisoner. He looked at him as the other half of a terrifying, inexplicable equation. He saw the exhaustion on Elian's face, the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, and understood the cost of his intervention. "You took it from me," Kyle stated, the realization dawning in his eyes. You took some of it. The Omega in Elian preened at the Alpha's recognition, a faint, treacherous purr starting in his chest. He ruthlessly crushed it. Don't mistake it for kindness, Elian said, his voice cold, though it lacked its usual conviction. Your incapacitation is a threat to my survival. It was self-preservation. Kyle's mouth quirked in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. It was a bitter, ironic expression. Of course, he said softly. Logic. I should have known. He finally let his hand drop. The moment of raw connection was over, the walls sliding back into place, but the foundation had been irrevocably shaken. They both knew now that the bond was not just a one-way chain of control. It was a bridge, and it could carry traffic in both directions. The incident changed the atmosphere in the spire from a cold war to a tense, unstable truce. Kyle no longer avoided Elian. Instead, he began to seek him out, his visits cloaked in the guise of official necessity. He would bring Elian data slates from his own office, security reports on Omega dissidents, case files on unregistered bondings that had ended in tragedy. For your information, he would state, his tone clinical, to help you understand the necessity of the current system. But Elian knew it was more than that. It was an excuse to be near him, to study him. And through the bond, Elian could feel the real reason. Kyle was trying to understand himself. By observing Elian, by feeling the world through Elian's empathic senses, he was exploring the parts of his own humanity he had long ago amputated. Elian, in turn, found himself looking at the reports. He saw the cold, hard data of a world steeped in biological chaos. Omegas driven mad by suppressants, alphas going feral in territorial disputes, children born from unstable pairings and abandoned to the state. He saw the brutal, ugly reality that Kale's sterile order was designed to prevent. He began to see the fear behind Kale's logic, the genuine, if misguided, belief that he was protecting his people from their own worst instincts. He hated him for his methods, but he started, terrifyingly, to understand his motives. Their conversations became debates, intellectual sparring matches over the nature of freedom and control, instinct and civilization. You see only the cage, Kyle argued one night, gesturing to the glittering city below them. I see the million lives that are safe within its walls. I see the children who are fed, the elders who are cared for, the society that functions without tearing itself apart. A functioning society is not the same as a living one, Elian countered, his voice quiet but firm. You've created a beautiful, intricate clockwork, Director, but you've removed its heart. It ticks, but it doesn't live. He felt Kyle's frustration, but it was different now. It was the frustration of a man who was beginning to suspect there was a flaw in his perfect logic, a variable he could not solve. He was starting to feel the absence of the heart. The true turning point came with the onset of Elian's heat. He had been off suppressants for months, and his body, awakened by the constant proximity of his bonded alpha, was finally succumbing to its natural cycle. It started as a low, simmering warmth in his belly, a restlessness he couldn't shake. His scent, the familiar fragrance of rain and herbs, began to sweeten, taking on a heady, musky note of fertile earth and blooming flowers. Through the bond, he felt Kale's immediate, visceral reaction. It was like a lightning strike to the alpha's disciplined mind, a jolt of pure, undiluted lust, so powerful it buckled Kale's knees, where he stood in his office 50 floors below. Elian felt it as if it were his own. a mirror image of the need coiling in his own gut. Panic seized him. A heat here, in this sterile tower, with his captor. It was his worst nightmare. He tried to fight it, to will his body into submission, but it was an unstoppable tide. The warmth became a fever. His skin grew sensitive, and a slick moisture began to gather between his thighs. The Omega was in complete control now. Its only focus, the bonded alpha, whose scent was a siren call. Kale appeared at his door minutes later. He had shed his uniform jacket, his white shirt was open at the collar, and his breathing was harsh. His eyes, those winter sky eyes, were dark with a storm of instinct he was barely holding in check. His scent flooded the room, sharp and electric, a possessive, claiming wave of pure alpha dominance. Elian, he rasped, and his name was a prayer and a curse. Elian was on the floor, curled on a rug, his body trembling with the force of the fever. He looked up at Kyle, his vision blurred with need. The archivist was gone. The rebel was gone. There was only the Omega, helpless in the grip of its biology, seeing its mate, its alpha. Kale, he whimpered, the name torn from him by instinct, a sound of pure surrender. The use of his name shattered the last of Kale's control. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, dropping to his knees in front of Elian. He didn't touch him. He just breathed him in, his whole body shuddering with the effort of restraint. "This is," he began, his voice strained, a biological imperative, a chemical reaction." He was trying to rationalize it, to put it in a box his logical mind could handle. Elian laughed, a breathless, broken sound. "Stop fighting it," he whispered, his own hand reaching out, his fingers brushing against Kale's jaw. "Stop trying to put the storm in a bottle, just for tonight. Let it rain." He saw the war in Kale's eyes. The director versus the alpha, the logician versus the beast. And for the first time, he saw the beast winning. Kale leaned in, his forehead resting against Elian's, his eyes closing. "I don't know how," he confessed, his voice a raw whisper of agony. "I have never let go." It was the most honest, vulnerable thing Elian had ever heard him say. In that moment, he was not Director Valerius. He was just Kale, a man as trapped by his own control as Elian had been by his suppressants. A wave of empathy, powerful and overwhelming, washed away Elian's fear. He was not a victim here. They were 2 halves of a whole, both broken, both starving. He threaded his fingers into Kyle's hair, pulling him closer, his mouth finding Kyle's. The kiss was not like the first one. It was not a claiming. It was a mutual, desperate surrender. It was a plea for connection, for release, for a moment of shared, beautiful, terrifying chaos. The world dissolved into heat and scent and sensation. It was not a fever dream this time. It was painfully, vividly real. It was a slow, deliberate exploration, a relearning of each other's bodies away from the anonymity of the mask. Kyle's control, once broken, gave way to a deep, profound tenderness that shattered Elian's heart. He was not a conqueror. He was a worshipper. Every touch was a question, every kiss a discovery. And through the bond, their minds merged in a way they never had before. There were no secrets, no walls. Elian felt the crushing weight of Kale's loneliness, the immense burden of his duty, the secret, terrified yearning for a connection he believed he could never have. Kale, in turn, was immersed in Elian's world, the quiet desperation of his old life, the terror of the mark, the suffocating beauty of the spire, and the deep, abiding dream of a freedom he had only ever read about in poetry. They were not just an alpha and an omega satisfying a biological urge. They were two souls, stripped bare, finally seeing each other for the first time. As the heat peaked, as their bodies moved in a frantic, desperate rhythm, Kale buried his face in the curve of Elian's neck, next to the silvery scar he had made. "Elian," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion Elian had never felt from him before. Not lust, not possession. It was a raw, terrified, overwhelming wave of love, a chaotic, illogical, uncontrollable variable that his system had no way to account for. And as he found his own release, crying out Kale's name, Elian knew that the bond, the mark, the chain that had once been his prison, had just become the key to a door he never knew existed. They had not been contained. They had been irrevocably, beautifully compromised. The aftermath of the heat was a fragile, unnerving peace. The biological urgency had receded, leaving behind a profound, terrifying intimacy. They lay tangled in the sheets of Elian's bed, the morning light painting stripes across their bodies. The air was thick with the mingled, sated sense of rain-soaked earth and the clean calm after a storm. Kyle was asleep, truly, deeply asleep, for what felt like the first time since Elian had met him. The constant, weary tension had drained from his face, leaving him looking younger, more vulnerable. The director was gone, and only the man remained. Elian watched him, his heart a confused, aching knot in his chest. He had hated this man. He had feared him. He had fought him. And now he had seen the soul behind the armor, had felt the crushing loneliness that shaped his every action. The hatred was gone, replaced by a complex, painful empathy that felt dangerously close to the emotion Kale had confessed in the throes of his passion. Love. The thought was terrifying. Loving his captor, loving the architect of his oppression. It felt like the ultimate betrayal of himself. Yet lying here, feeling the steady, calm rhythm of Kale's mind through the bond, a quiet hum of contentment and peace that Elian had never felt from him before, he couldn't deny the connection. It was more than a mark, more than biology. They had broken each other, and in the breaking had found the missing pieces of themselves. A soft chime from the wall panels startled them both. Kale came awake instantly, his body tensing, the director slamming back into place. The calm in the bond was shattered by a jolt of alarm and ice-cold professionalism. Director Valerius, a crisp, synthesized voice announced, "Priority message from Central Command, Code Alpha." Kyle sat up, rubbing his face, the weariness crashing back down on him. He glanced at Elian, his eyes a conflicted mix of regret for the interrupted peace and the habitual assumption of command. "Acknowledged," he said to the wall. He stood and began to dress, his movements efficient and precise. The tender lover of the night was gone, replaced by the cold, calculating strategist. Elian felt a pang of loss so sharp it stole his breath. He sat up, pulling the sheet around himself. "What is it?" "A security matter," Kale said, his voice clipped, already distant. He was closing himself off, rebuilding his walls. But the bond was still there, a crack in his armor, and Elian could feel the truth beneath the evasion. It was a cold spike of dread, a sense of being discovered. "It's about us, isn't it?" Elian asked, his voice quiet. Kyle paused in buttoning his uniform, his back to Elian. He didn't answer for a long moment. Finally he turned, his face a grim, stony mask. "There was a pheromonal surge detected from this location," he said, his voice low and flat. "An unregistered Omega heat signature. powerful and unfiltered, originating from the director's spire. They're opening an internal investigation. The floor dropped out from under Elian's world for the second time. They had been so lost in each other, they had forgotten the omnipresent, unblinking eye of the system. Kale's own security measures, his own perfect system of control, had betrayed him. They will send a medical team, Kale continued, his mind working at lightning speed, a torrent of calculations and contingencies that Elian could feel through the bond. They will want to examine you, to confirm the source of the surge. They will see the mark. They will know. What will they do? Elian whispered, his hand instinctively going to the scar on his neck. To me, they will do what they do to all unsanctioned, bonded Omegas, Kyle said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion, a chilling, clinical detachment. They will attempt chemical bond severance. It's experimental, excruciating, and rarely successful. If it fails, they will place you in cryostasis indefinitely. You will be classified as a biological contaminant. The words were a death sentence. Elian felt the blood drain from his face. And you? Kyle finished buttoning his collar, the gesture finalizing his transformation back into the unassailable director. I will be stripped of my rank and authority. I will be tried for dereliction of duty, for consorting with an unregistered Omega, for compromising the security of the state. I will be reconditioned. They will make an example of me. He looked at Elian, and for a fleeting second, the mask slipped. Elian saw not fear for himself, but a profound, terrifying fear for Elian. The system he had built, the system he had served his entire life, was about to turn on them, and its jaws were inescapable. There is no way out, Elian breathed, the reality of it crushing him. We're trapped. There is always a way, Kyle said, a new, dangerous light in his eyes. The logician was presented with an unsolvable problem, and his mind was already working on a new paradigm. The system is designed to control from within. Its greatest weakness is the assumption that no one would ever want to leave. He walked over to the vast window, looking down at the city. His city, a perfect, glittering machine of his own design. I built this cage, he said, softly, more to himself than to Elian. I know where the hinges are weak. I know where the locks are rusted. He turned back to Elian, his face set with a terrifying, absolute resolve. They will send a team within the hour. We need to be gone before they arrive. We are leaving the city. Elian stared at him, dumbfounded. Leaving? To where? The outside it's nothing. It's toxic wastelands and feral zones. It is not under my control, Kale said, and the words held a world of meaning. It was the one place his logic, his authority, his system held no sway. It was the ultimate variable. It is freedom. Freedom. The word he had only ever read in poetry. The concept he had weaponized against Kale, now being offered to him by Kale himself. The irony was staggering. They will hunt us, Elian said, the practicalities of the insane plan crashing in. You are the director of domestic security. You are the hunter. They will use your own protocols against you. Yes, Kale agreed, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. And I know the flaw in every single one of them. Get dressed, he commanded, his voice once again that of the alpha, the leader. But this time it was not a command of a captor to his prisoner. It was the command of a general to his soldier, his partner. Wear dark, practical clothing. We have very little time. Elian didn't hesitate. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in his stomach. but it was overshadowed by a wild, terrifying surge of hope. He scrambled out of bed, his mind racing. As he pulled on the dark tunic and trousers Kyle indicated, he felt a shift in the bond. Kyle was systematically accessing his own command protocols, slicing through firewalls, erasing data, creating false trails. He was dismantling his life's work from the inside out, with a speed and precision that was breathtaking. The hunter was erasing his own tracks, preparing to become the hunted. They met at the suite's exit, two fugitives ready to leap into the abyss. Kyle held a small, heavy pack. He looked at Elian, his eyes scanning him, a flicker of something soft, something possessive in his gaze. "The mark," he said. "It will be a liability. They can track its pheromonal signature." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metallic disc, a dermal suppressor patch, the same kind of technology Elian had once used to hide his Omega nature. "This will block the scent," Kyle said, holding it out. Elian looked at the patch, then at the scar on his neck, the symbol of his bondage that had somehow become the catalyst for his liberation. To cover it now felt wrong, like a betrayal. "No," he said, his voice firm. He met Kyle's gaze, his chin held high. "I spent my whole life hiding what I am. I'm not going to start again." Kyle stared at him, a slow, dawning comprehension in his eyes. He was seeing not the frightened Omega from the mask, or the defiant prisoner in his tower, but an equal, a partner who was choosing to face the storm with him, unmasked and unafraid. He slowly closed his hand around the patch and nodded, a look of profound, solemn respect on his face. "As you wish," he said. "Let's go." He led the way, not to the main lifts, but to a service panel hidden behind a section of wall. He keyed in a code, and the panel slid open, revealing a dark, narrow shaft. A maintenance ladder descended into the bowels of the spire. "This will take us to the sub-levels," Kale explained, his voice echoing in the confined space. "To the old geothermal vent system, the one the consortium abandoned decades ago." Elian's heart skipped a beat. The geothermal vents, the same lawless, unmonitored territory where the Black Mask was held. The place where their story had begun. It was a perfect, terrible symmetry. They were returning to the place of their first mistake, hoping it would be the place of their salvation. Kyle started down the ladder, his movements sure and steady. Elian followed, the cold metal rungs biting into his hands. As he descended into the darkness, leaving the sterile, white luxury of his prison behind, he glanced up, one last time. Through the opening, he could see the soft, programmed light of the suite, a picture of a life that was already a ghost. He was descending into the unknown with the man who had been his monster, his captor, his lover. He was terrified, and he had never felt so alive. The descent through the spire's guts was a journey back in time, through the layers of the city's history. The upper levels were clean, silent, filled with humming conduits and fiber optic cables. As they went lower, the technology grew more archaic. Thick, insulated pipes replaced the conduits, the air grew warmer, and the smell of ozone was replaced by the scent of hot metal and mineral deposits. It was a descent from a sterile digital heaven into a hot, mechanical hell. Kale moved with a grim, focused purpose, his thoughts a sharp, clear broadcast through the bond. Access points, security patrol timings, structural weaknesses. He was navigating his own creation from the inside out, like a virus moving through a system's veins. Elian followed, his own senses on high alert. The bond was a tactical advantage. He could feel Kyle's tension, the slight spike in his adrenaline when they passed a functioning audio sensor, the quiet satisfaction when they bypassed a pressure plate. They were a single unit, moving and thinking in concert. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the bottom. Kale pushed open a heavy, rusted hatch, and they stepped out into the familiar, chaotic warmth of the geothermal vents. The air was thick with steam and the smell of sulfur, and in the distance, Elian could hear the low thrum of the Undercity. They were back where it all began, but everything had changed. They were not masked strangers seeking an anonymous thrill. They were bonded fugitives, running for their lives. "This way," Kyle said, his voice low. "There's a defunct freight tunnel that leads to the outer wall. The schematics are over a century old. It's not in any current security database." As they moved through the labyrinth of steam-filled tunnels, the bond suddenly flared with a sharp, piercing alarm. It was Kale's, a cold, sickening jolt. "They're here," Kale breathed, his body going rigid. "In the spire. My personal access codes have been locked out. They know." Elian felt it too, a distant sense of being hunted. A cold, methodical presence sweeping through the spire far above them. Kyle's former subordinates, the enforcers he had trained. "They'll seal the Undercity exits," Elian said, his mind racing. "They'll start sweeping the vent system." "I know," Kyle said, his jaw tight. "They'll be using pheromone sniffers. They'll be looking for you." He looked at Elian, at the pale, silvery mark on his neck, the mark that was now a beacon, guiding their hunters directly to them. The choice Elian had made, the defiant refusal to hide, was about to cost them everything. Regret, sharp and bitter, flashed through Elian. "I should have taken the patch." "No," Kale said, his voice fierce, his hand gripping Elian's arm. "You were right. We do not hide." His eyes scanned their surroundings, the strategist assessing a new, impossible battlefield. "We changed the equation. They are hunting for 1 Omega cent. We will give them 1,000. He pulled Elian toward a massive, sealed archway, the same one Elian remembered from the night of the mask. The club. It was silent now, deserted. Kale placed his hand on the door's control panel. It was dead. "The main power is cut after hours," he muttered. "But there's an auxiliary system." He knelt, prying open a floor plate, revealing a tangle of thick cables. He pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from his boot and began to expertly strip 2 of the wires. Elian could feel his intense concentration, the precise, logical flow of his thoughts as he worked. There was a spark, a hum, and the panel by the door flickered to life. Kale keyed in a code. The heavy door hissed open. The air that rolled out was stale, thick with the ghost of 1,000 scents, sweat, synth ale, and the faint, lingering pheromones of the last night's revelers. It was a sensory graveyard. "The club's atmospheric system," Kale said, pointing to a large grate in the wall. "It vents directly into the main geothermal conduits to mask the club's activity. If I can override the filters and flush the system's scent reservoirs, we can flood the entire vent network with residual pheromones. It will blind their sniffers. Give us time." It was a brilliant, desperate gamble. As Cal worked on the club's main console, his fingers flying across the screen, Elian stood guard at the door, his senses stretched to their limit, trying to feel the approach of the hunters through the bond. He could feel them now, a cold, organized presence spreading through the upper vents, methodical and relentless. They were getting closer. "Kyle," he urged, his voice tight. "They're coming." "Almost," Kyle gritted out, sweat beading on his forehead. "The security protocols on this are robust." Suddenly, a wave of raw, unfiltered alpha pheromones, sharp and aggressive, washed over Elian from down the corridor. Not Kale's. These were harsh, undisciplined. It was the scent of enforcers on the hunt. "They're here," Elian hissed. He could hear the heavy tread of boots, the clink of equipment. Two figures, in the dark grey armor of the Enforcer Corps, appeared at the far end of the tunnel, their helmet-mounted lights cutting through the steam. "Director Valerius," a voice, amplified and metallic, boomed down the corridor. "Surrender the asset. You are ordered to stand down." Kale swore under his breath, typing the last line of code. He slammed his palm on the console. A deep, mechanical groan shuddered through the club, and with a deafening roar, the ventilation system kicked into life. A thick, overwhelming cloud of multi-layered scents billowed out of the grate, a pheromonal fog that was suffocating in its intensity. The ghost of the mask, 1,000 nights of desperation and desire, was unleashed into the vents. The enforcers down the hall recoiled, their senses overwhelmed. Their amplified voices crackled with confusion. "Sensors are overloaded. I can't get a lock." Kale grabbed Elian's hand. "Now!" They plunged back into the steam-filled tunnels, now thick with the chaotic, disorienting scent cloud. They ran, their footsteps echoing, the shouts of the enforcers fading behind them. They were running blind, but Kale held a map in his head, and Elian had the bond, a clear, pure signal in the sensory chaos, a psychic lighthouse guiding him through the storm of Kale's own making. They finally reached a massive, circular door, sealed with a wheel that looked like it hadn't been turned in a century. The freight tunnel. Together, they put their shoulders to the wheel. It groaned, resisted, the metal screaming in protest. The Omega and the Alpha, the Archivist and the Director, pushed as one. Elian could feel Kale's strength, the disciplined power in his muscles, and he added his own desperate energy. With a final, shuddering clang, the lock disengaged. The door swung inward, revealing a vast, dark expanse. The air that washed over them was different. It was cold, thin, and carried a scent Elian had only ever read about. The scent of dust, of decay, and of wild, living things. The scent of the outside. They scrambled through, Kyle sealing the heavy door behind them. They were plunged into near total darkness, the only light a faint grey luminescence from cracks in the tunnel ceiling far above. They stood for a moment, panting, their hearts hammering in the profound silence. The hunt was behind them. Before them, the unknown. "We made it," Elian breathed, the words forming a small white cloud in the cold air. "For now," Kale said, his voice grim. "This tunnel will take us beyond the city's perimeter wall. But the journey from there, it will not be easy." He looked at Elion in the dim light, his face streaked with grime and sweat. The Director was gone completely now, stripped away by their desperate flight. All that was left was Kale, the Alpha, the fugitive, his mate beside him. He reached out, his hand gently cupping Elian's jaw. His thumb brushed over Elian's cheek, a gesture of profound, aching tenderness. "I am sorry, Elian," he whispered, his voice rough with an emotion Elian couldn't name. "For all of it. For the mark. For the cage. I was trying to protect you, and I only ever caused you pain." "You also set me free," Elian whispered back, his own hand coming up to cover Kale's. He leaned into the touch, a simple, profound gesture of acceptance. The bond between them hummed, no longer a source of conflict or a tool of war, but a quiet, steady current of shared understanding, shared hope, shared fate. They were no longer a director and his prisoner. They were just Kyle and Alien, two souls, bound by a mistake, who had chosen to turn their chain into an anchor. They stood on a ridge overlooking the ruins of what had once been a suburb, the skeletons of houses clawing at a sky the color of a bruised plum. Behind them, the city they had fled was a distant, silent silhouette, its glittering spire a needle pointed at a heaven it didn't believe in. The air here was thin and sharp, and it carried scents that were alien and overwhelming to Elian. The damp, rich smell of living soil, the decay of wet leaves, the distant, briny tang of a salt flat. It was the chaotic, beautiful scent of a world that was not managed. It was the scent of freedom. Kale stood beside him, a silent, powerful presence. He had shed the last remnants of his uniform, leaving him in a simple, dark tunic that made him seem less like a symbol of power and more like a man. The weariness was still in his eyes, but it was different now. It was the physical exhaustion of a survivor, not the soul-deep fatigue of a king on a lonely throne. "I spent my whole life reading about this," Elian said, his voice soft, almost reverent, as he watched a pair of ragged-winged birds circle in the updrafts. "But the words, they're just pale ghosts. This is real." "It's dangerous," Kale countered, his gaze scanning the horizon, the strategist in him unable to rest. "Unpredictable. There are feral packs, toxic zones from the collapse, no infrastructure, no law." "There is no consortium," Elian replied, turning to look at him. "There is no Department of Domestic Security. There is no one to tell you who to be." Kale met his gaze, and in the pale light of the dawning sun, Elian saw the truth of his words land. The vast, crushing weight of Kyle's identity, of his duty, was gone. He was unbound. The prospect was as terrifying for him as the outside world was for Elian. "I don't know who I am without it," Kyle confessed, the admission a quiet, stunning act of vulnerability. "You are Kyle," Elian said simply. He reached out and took Kyle's hand, his fingers lacing with the alphas. "And I am Elian. That is all we need to be." The bond between them pulsed with a warming, gentle light. It was no longer a conduit for pain or control, but a simple, profound connection, a shared space where their two souls could meet. He could feel Kale's fear, his uncertainty, but underneath it, a fragile, nascent seed of hope. Elian squeezed his hand. "Where do we go?" Kyle looked out at the sprawling, wild landscape. "There are stories," he said, his voice distant, "whispers in the deep archives that I was never meant to see, about enclave communities hidden in the mountains to the west, people who survived the collapse without the consortium's help, who learned to live with the chaos." "We go west then," Elian said, a smile finally touching his lips. It felt like a foreign, wonderful sensation. They had no map, no supplies beyond the small pack Kyle carried, and the most powerful government in the world was likely hunting them. Their chances were slim. Their future was a terrifying, beautiful blank page. But as they stood there, hand in hand, the marked Omega and the fallen director, watching the sun rise over a broken, beautiful world, they were not afraid. They had lost everything they had ever known, but they had found each other. The mark on Elian's neck, once a brand of ownership, a symbol of a terrible mistake, now felt warm against his skin. It was not a chain. It was a promise, a testament to the idea that even in the most controlled, sterile system, a wild, chaotic, illogical thing like love could bloom, and in its blooming, shatter the whole world. They turned their backs on the city of their birth and started walking west, two fugitives stepping into the first day of their real lives, their path guided not by a map, but by the unbreakable bond that connected them, a silent, steady hum that said, "Wherever we go together."